morning, everyone. And welcome to the Wolverine Caucus. We're so excited that you're here today. And you'll probably hear me state all through the event today how wonderful it is that today is a capstone event for us. Today marks the 25th year of the Wolverine Caucus. How about that? And throughout these years, it has been such a joy as we go forward into 2019 to think back and remember all of the events that we've been able to cover that serendipitously connected with what our wonderful state legislature's been working on, what our governors have signed into law, and all of the things that we've been able to contribute with our excellent speakers and presenters from the University of Michigan. So, as you know, these forums are sponsored by the UM Alumni Association and the UM Office of the Vice President for Government Relations. And we couldn't do it without all of your support, so thank you again. We are going to have a speaker today that some of you have heard a number of times, and he is one of our very favorites. So to introduce him is none other than Ann Arbor's own State Representative, Adam Zemke. Representative Zemke represents the 55th District, and he serves on the Education Reform Committee as the Democratic Vice Chair. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Representative Zemke to the podium, and he might allow me to say, go blue.
This is an ongoing, somewhat humorous joke because I am a proud Spartan, but a native Ann Arborite, and we are very pleased at the University of Michigan participate in Ann Arbor and our Michigan economy. We know how important Go Blue is to Michigan. So Professor Traugott, did I pronounce that correctly? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. I was concerned about that. Is going to talk about a topic that I think is on the minds of everybody, or at least I sure hope is on the minds of everybody, which is the upcoming election. And the reason that it should be on the minds of everyone, or at least I hope that it is for absolutely no self-serving purpose, because I think many of us here are terming out of the legislature, but because it's going to determine the outcome of policies for the next 8 years, really. And that's going to be very interesting to watch on a state level. And we are seeing, and have seen up to this point, very interesting and non-traditional election patterns in the primaries. At least on the Democratic side of the aisle, we ended up running out of ballots in certain communities. And it's a good problem to have. Be very interesting to see what the good professor's research talks to us about as to what that indicates, if anything, for the general election. And there's a lot of money and a lot of people who are very intelligent who do a lot of work on trying to predict outcomes of elections. Sometimes it's accurate, other times it's not so accurate. And I'm very interested to hear what you have to say, in fact. And so the one thing I will say is that there is never a wave of any kind, red, blue, pink, or otherwise, without hard work. And so I would encourage everyone in this room to make sure that you are talking with all of your friends and family and encouraging them to get out and vote, particularly with the elimination of straight ticket. Since the first time since 1891, it is going to be a change in patterns for people when they get to the polls, regardless of what one's opinion is on straight ticket. It's going to be different for folks. So make sure they're educated so that they can get in, get out efficiently, and cast their ballot for whomever they so choose. So, Professor, thank you for coming, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. And go play.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Likewise,
Yeah. Let me see if this is working. Is the lapel mic on? Great. Okay. It's a real treat to be here. I always enjoy coming to Lansing for these talks because I have such an interested and politically motivated audience. A lot of good questions, and I'm looking forward to that at the end. And I'm just going to jump right into it. So this is what the election is going to look like, I think, in general. Across the last several sequences, we have seen party identification play a more important role. More people are voting their party ID, and more people are actually voting a straight party than in the past. And in the United States, there are more Democrats than Republicans, as there are in Michigan as well. Democrats tend not to get to the polls with as high turnout as Republicans, and that tends often to balance things out. And in the past, Democrats were known for splitting their tickets more than Republicans, but as I said, that's gone away. The campaign has just getting underway, and I think we will see these two broad contrasting themes between the Republicans arguing for the need to continue to drain the swamp, and the Democrats arguing that we need a return to normal order, that there are several unusual and for some disorienting aspects of the Trump administration that could be remedied by a shift in control of the Congress. And there's also be an emphasis on the middle class and how deep the economic recovery has penetrated the American population. Even before the Kavanaugh hearings, gender was going to be an important part of this campaign. You've seen it in the primaries and the number of female candidates nominated by the Democrats. And you'll see this in the general election. And as I'll mention at the very end, gender has important consequences for the distribution of partisanship, party identification in the United States. It's very likely that the Democrats are going to capture the House. This is as simple as looking at historical trends. But the interesting question is what happens in the Senate. And I'll give you the punchline at the beginning. It's not likely that the Democrats will be able to capture the Senate, that it'll remain equally divided still. So these are the historical data on outcomes for the midterm seat losses of the president's party going back to 1994. And you can see that most of the lines are pointed downward, that almost every time in a midterm election, the president's party loses seats. The average loss is about 30. And I know that people in this room follow politics, and you know that the Democrats have to pick up 24 seats to capture control of the House. So this is the broad basis on which we have an expectation that the Democrats will, in fact, be victorious. One of the most common questions that's asked in national polls is what's called the generic ballot question. If the election were held today, would you vote for the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate? And these are the data across the year, actually since the beginning of the Trump administration, for the proportion who answer, I'm going to vote for the Democrat or I'm going to vote for the Republican. And here you see the standard colors, where blue is Democrat and red is Republican. And you can see that there's about a 8.3 percentage point advantage for the Democrats. One of the things that's interesting about this is that this pattern was apparent almost from the start of the Trump administration. And let's see if this works. It does, but you can hardly see it. But if you look here in this period, which is since late in the summer, you'll see that the percent saying Democratic is ticked up a little bit, while the percent saying Republican is held relatively steady. But 8 percentage points is a fair amount of a lead for the Democrats. And this is a graph of the relationship between the generic ballot average. You remember that Trump is at 40.1, and the president's party two-party vote share. And at the low end of the scale, the president's party, the Republicans, will do better than 40%. That this particular set of data suggests they'll get close to 45. But that means the Democrats would get about 55. They'd have about a 10 percentage point average and the lead. And the question is, how does that translate into a seat advantage? Well, one way to think about this, 10 points seems like a lot, and 55% seems like a lot. But there are two periods in the US in which we can think about how polarization and gerrymandering have affected the vote. If you look here prior to 1980 or so, a landslide used to be around 56%. Now a landslide is around 54%. If the Democrats get 55, it doesn't look like a big difference, but you can see that there's been a big shift here, which I'll tell you a little more about in a moment. If the Democrats got to 55, that would be as well as they did in 2008, the Obama election. And this is an indication of swing voting in the United States, switching from one party to another. In this case, in the presidential election. And you can see starting in 2000, that has ticked down a little bit. The steady voters, the line at the top, this line, but that the swing voters, those who have switched, has declined. And this is another indicator of polarization in the American electorate and the reluctance of people to vote for somebody from the other party. The other thing that's happened, of course, is with the advent of computers, more and more precise gerrymandering. Some of you are probably familiar with the terms packing and cracking, which is the two key concepts in a recent series of Supreme Court cases. The Republicans have become more skillful and because of 2010, gained a big advantage in control of state legislatures. And they have been able to concentrate the votes of Democrats in urban areas with very large majorities. And they've been able to spread out Republican votes in suburban and rural areas so that they've made safe seats but with smaller margins. And so the number of uncontested districts has declined primarily because of shifts in the South. This chart goes back to the 1940s, right? So there are fewer safe Democratic seats in the South. And now there's only about 1 in 10 House races that's contested. That means less than 55-45. So that's a little bit about the history of voting in the midterm elections. Now I want to turn to talk about the various factors that affect the outcome of midterm elections. Political scientists and now the people that we call data aggregators have developed a series of models to estimate the outcomes based upon a variety of factors. I used this quote from a statistician, George Box: "All models are wrong, but some models are useful." No model predicts events in the future with complete accuracy, but some models can do reasonably well, and we think the models of the political scientists and also the data aggregators like Nate Silver generally have done pretty well. And here are 4 factors that are usually incorporated in these models. First is presidential approval. Many people think that a midterm election is a referendum on the incumbent president. There's been a slight revision in this theory among political scientists who now talk about party balancing as well as presidential approval. A concern that people have about one party getting too much control, exercising too much control of government, and some people will vote for the other party just to try to balance things out. Retrospective evaluations of the economy, how people are doing economically, financially. Structural factors, whose seats are at stake. We know that if you are a House incumbent, your chances of re-election are somewhere around 95%. In the Republican Party in particular, this is why primaries have become so important, because the districts have become safe for Republicans in the general election, but they can be challenged to a greater degree than Democrats in the primaries. And as I've already mentioned, in a midterm election, the president's party ordinarily loses seats, and so the models often deal with how many seats will be lost, not whether they will be lost or not. The Senate is a special case. I'll talk about that a little bit at the end. So here are the data from Real Clear Politics about Donald Trump's approval ratings. The red line is disapproval, and the black line is approval. And this pattern across the last 18 or 19 months is a little different than the typical presidents, in that most presidents start out with a honeymoon period where most Americans are wishing the president well. And then what we observe typically is a decline in support from the members of the other party, and then a decline in support from the independents. And then depending upon the circumstances, the partisans of the president's party stick with them more or less. But you can see at the beginning that there was no honeymoon period for Donald Trump. And that is, I think, primarily because of the acrimony associated with the campaign and then the final outcome, where Hillary Clinton won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College vote by a fair amount. And you can see how the president's disapproval rating, the red line, increased through last fall. As the economy ticked up, the disapproval rating or percentage declined while his approval rating increased. We'll have to see, especially in economic terms, how the president's action with regard to tariffs trickles down to the average American, and whether or not this trend reverses. This is a chart of the relationship between presidential approval and seat loss or gain. So you can see in the lower left corner, the president was at 41.4% in that Real Clear Politics chart. That looks like it could be a seat loss of over 60. We find that, I find that unlikely. That would be an extreme case, but you can see that across presidents since the 1950s, the lower their approval rating, the more seats their party loses. at the midterm. And that currently, the Republican Party in the House is near the bottom end of this distribution. This is another thing that's going on about particular candidates in this election, which is the number of Republicans who have decided not to run again. That obviously diminishes their incumbency advantage if it becomes an open contest and there's a new Democrat and a new Republican running for an open seat. This is another source of vulnerability for the Republicans in this year's election. So there are two kinds of models I mentioned of the outcomes of House elections. One comes from the data aggregators. This comes from 538.com. This is Nate Silver's site. This is what we call a histogram, the outcome of a large number of simulations. And the height of the bar is the frequency with which that outcome occurs. And this is the whole range of outcomes. And you can see that 80% of the outcomes, 4 out of 5 outcomes, are blue. So his estimate is that the Democrats have a 4 in 5 chance of taking the House. Now, if you look in this part of the distribution, their advantage would be small. It would be on the order of 20 seats, 25 seats or so. Here is the best guess, which is 37 Democratic seats won. And remember that 24 is the number required to take the majority. And obviously the obverse of that is that the Republicans have a 1 in 5 chance of holding on to the majority. The economy is very hard to figure in terms of its impact in this election. Obviously, if you have holdings in the stock market, which could be personal holdings, it could be your retirement plan, you've done very well in the last 18 months. But if you look at wages, this chart shows that the top 10% and the bottom 10% of the US population have done relatively well during the Trump administration for 2 different reasons. The top 10% is the blue line, the bottom 10% is the green line. The blue line has increased this is, the starting point here is the beginning of the market collapse, right? But the Trump administration is going to start in here, 2017, right? This is the argument about who's responsible for the recovery. But we're going to focus on this part. And if you're in the top 10%, your salary and wages have gone up a considerable amount because of the kind of work that you do. And if you're in the bottom 10%, your wages have gone up because 17 states have increased the minimum wage. And there are another 7 states that will have an increase in the minimum wage within the next 12 months, by the beginning of next year. So people at the lower end have improved not because of economic conditions, but for legal reasons, the change in the law. But if you are at the 50th percentile, that is, if you are a person where half of the population earns more than you do, and the other half of the population earns less than you do, your net increase has been only about 0.6% compared to 2009. You're barely back to even. So these are the parameters for the dispute about who is benefiting from the economic recovery and how much. This shows a measure of monthly change in personal disposable income, and on the left you see a chart in the last year, and you can see that for every month during the Trump administration, the change in personal disposable income has been positive. And in the last month, compared to the month before, it was up, I think it's 2.3%. But here are the data by state, from highest increase to lowest increase. There's one place that's negative. And Michigan sits here at 31st. So our improvement in personal disposable income, our collective improvement in personal disposable income is positive, but it's relatively low compared to other states. This is the distribution of party identification going back to 2004, where again the blue line is the Democrats and the red line is the Republicans. And you can see that there are some periods, for example, in 2011, where they were about equal in strength, but since about 2015, the Democrats have been gaining a little bit. They're almost 48%, and about 42% identifies Republicans. This is a built-in advantage for Democratic candidates, all other things equal. These are Gallup data, and you may know that when they ask about party identification, they ask if you are a Democrat, Republican, or an independent, and if you are a Democrat or a Republican, they say, are you strong or not so strong? And if you're an independent, they say, well, do you lean more to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party? So this has the leaners incorporated. That's why this adds up to closer to 100%. This is just another look at presidential approval. It's in relation to several recent presidents. You can see the Trump line in dark red at the bottom. He has lower approval than any recent president. You can see generally the decline from the honeymoon period into 18 months into their term. This, of course, is 9/11, the jump in approval of George Bush. So again, in historical terms, the Republican Party is at a disadvantage because of Trump's approval rating. One thing that's important is how enthusiastic members of each party are about their candidates. And you may know that turnout, this is a kind of a weird number, but turnout aggregated across all the primaries for the Democrats was about 5 or 6 percentage points higher than turnout for all of the Republicans. That's a weird number because the level of competitiveness in the races is different, and the number of candidates running is different and so on. But there's some indication that the Democrats in voting terms were more enthusiastic in the primaries than Republicans. These are questions going back to 94, asking people how enthusiastic they are about voting compared to the previous year. And on the top, you will see data for the entire sample. And generally, the Republicans were at least or more enthusiastic than Democrats. But now in June of 2018, this number for the Democrats is higher than the number for the Republicans. And down here, you'll see the data for the Republicans. And this is the most conservative Republicans are 53%, and the less conservative are 48%. Here, among the most liberal Democrats, this number is 64%. So the most ideological Democrats are the most enthusiastic about the upcoming election compared to the previous round. There are political scientists who have models to estimate the outcome of House elections, and they have a panel every other year at the American Political Science Association convention, where they put these people together and they produce their estimates at the end of August. And these are the forecasts for the Republican seat change in the House: 30, 27, 44, and 44. The first two are right around the average, and the last two are above the average. The first two didn't make an estimate of Senate seat outcomes, but the last two did, and they're only one seat off, again in the aggregate, not talking about specific seats, +2 and +1. +2 could do it for the Democrats. +1 would just leave us in a tie with Mike Pence casting critical votes. Whoops. I'll just say a couple of things quickly about the Senate race. The Democrats are at a disadvantage in terms of the seats that are up. You know that only a third of the Senate gets elected each time, and there are very substantial class effects depending upon who's up. And this is a cohort in which the Democrats have 29 seats at stake and the Republicans only have 6. And again, with reasonable candidates and a lot of money, the incumbents often have an advantage. But there are 8 critical seats that you should keep an eye on if you're interested in this. In Florida, Nelson is up for re-election. He hasn't run a very strong campaign against the governor. Tennessee has an open race, Bob Corker's seat. Claire McCaskill in Missouri, Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota. On the Republican side, there are also 4 seats. One of them is open, John McCain's former seat. In Nevada, Senator Heller is up. The race in Texas, many people thought would be easy because Texas has become such a Republican state, but that now seems to be competitive. And there's a race not very far away in Indiana, where Senator Donnelly could be at risk. So what lies ahead if the election turns out to be like this? First of all, I think we'll have a more deeply divided government even than we have now, but in a different way. We have a divided government now because of political polarization and the lack of interest and cooperation among elected Democrats and Republicans. But if the Democrats win the House, then we will have a lot of investigations started by the Democrats, continuous investigations of the president and other members of the cabinet. And we face the possibility of impeachment hearings eventually. That will depend a lot, I think, on the Mueller report. There's virtually no chance that the president will be impeached because it would require, I should say convicted, because that requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate. And no matter what the outcome in the Senate is, there won't be enough Democrats or Democrats in conjunction with a few Republicans to get to 2/3. We'll have to see what happens in just a couple of days and beyond with the Kavanaugh hearings. But one possibility is that the Senate will get called into a lame duck session, and if Kavanaugh withdraws, it doesn't look like the Republicans will take his name out of nomination. If Kavanaugh withdraws, I think there's a good chance that there'll be a lame duck session and another Supreme Court nominee before the new Senate takes office. Just a quick note about the parties. These are very difficult times for the Republican Party. because of their positions about women. The Kavanaugh hearings are contributing to this. Some scandals among Republican office holders are contributing to this. Women are a majority of the electorate. You can see here that they have been trending up with Democratic identification. There's a good chance that the Kavanaugh hearings are going to exacerbate this. You also know, I've talked about this before when I've been here to visit you, that America is on its way to becoming a white minority nation by the 2040s, 2043, 2044, 2045. The Republican positions on immigration, on diversity, may help them in the short term among their white base, but in the longer term, this is another kind of looming disaster for them. You can see in the top among whites how they used to be evenly divided, but now they're tilting towards the Republicans. You can see that there's not been very much difference among the partisanship of black Americans. They have been strongly Democratic for a long period of time. And now you can see since the 90s a clear Democratic advantage, about 30 percentage points among Hispanics. So the future of the Republican Party, not maybe not in the next several elections, but possibly by the late 2020s, doesn't look very good for the Republican Party. And another big divide that's appeared is in education. We saw this in the 2016 election, where you can see that on the upper left, for people with a high school education, less than a high school education, they have swung pretty sharply to the Republican Party. Those with some college but not a degree are also now more Republican. But among those who have a four-year college degree, this gap has closed, and the Democrats and the Republicans are essentially tied. And among those with a postgraduate degree, there's now almost a 20-point Democratic advantage in identification. I'll just say a couple of things quickly about the races in Michigan, then I'll be done. In light of what I told you about partisanship and these changing demographic trends, of course, the Democrats have an all-female slate at the top of the ballot. We haven't had very much polling in Michigan. This was a problem in the estimate of the outcome of the election in 2016, very few polls. But they show Gretchen Whitmer with a lead of the low double digits over Bill Schuette, somewhere around 10 or 11 percentage points. The campaign hasn't really started. We'll have to see what happens with the flow of ads in particular. And they'll have debates face to face. We'll see how that goes. And in the Senate race, Debbie Stabenow has been a very formidable incumbent. And James hasn't really, his campaign hasn't really taken off. And he is, in the polling that's taken place, also double digits behind by a little bit more in the last poll by 18 points. But again, this campaign has barely started, and we haven't seen debates between those two candidates. Those are the comments that I prepared, and I'd be glad to take questions. Did I get a handheld mic? Yeah. And I can walk around and I'll still be audible, right?
Yeah.
Good. All right, so I'll take the mic. There you are.
It's been my observation that 2 years ago, we had Democrats and Republicans. Now we have Democrats, Republicans, and Trump. And it is very confusing on our president, going back and forth and up and down and sideways. And I think it's got everybody kind of confused on who's doing what. We're constantly, every time you open the paper, investigating. Well, come on, guys. I mean, this is ridiculous.
You have to say a little more about which part is ridiculous.
Well, who's doing what to whom? I guess that's what it amounts to.
Well, it's pretty clear that Donald Trump has captured control of the party apparatus. And it's, from my perspective, it's been unfortunate that the Congress hasn't stepped up to its duty as an independent branch of government. I think that one of the losses in the Trump presidency, you know, this 18 or 20 month period, has been the career of Paul Ryan as the leader of the House. And whatever legacy he might have had, given that he's retiring, I think he's been damaged permanently by his inability to take action in the House. Yeah.
Has there been any research or polling on the efficacy of political ads, particularly the attack ads? Has anybody really done any work to see if they work or not or have any effect?
There has been research on the impact of ads and negative ads. Most of it has been to suppress turnout. And candidates and parties are engaged now more in campaigns of what we call mobilization, getting their own supporters out and trying to inhibit turnout among the opposition, rather than seeing ads with substantial issue-based content. We don't see many ads with issue-based content. Most of them are attack ads.
What is your sense as to the impact of no straight party voting for, at least for this upcoming election?
Well, I think taking straight party voting off the ballot, out of the ballot, is going to hurt the Democrats. And it probably was a strategic move on the part of the Republican-controlled legislature to do that.
Behind you over here.
Oh, sorry. I didn't turn around far enough.
Given the growth of Hispanic and Asian American populations, what kinds of impacts do those two groups and the demographic changes have?
Well, of course, if you lived in California or Arizona or Texas or Nevada, you would already be in a white minority population. And these groups are interested in more balanced and equal treatment, especially in employment, and they're very interested in education. And these are issues on which members of both of the parties could contest for their support, but we don't often see that. So this is one of the reasons that Hispanics are tilting towards the Democratic Party. It could change based upon the quality of the candidates that each party puts up and what kind of platforms and proposals they make to try to attract Hispanic voters. But right now, the Democrats have an advantage. Way in the back.
What effect do you
Sure.
think the ballot proposals will have on turnout by party?
Well, ordinarily, the ballot proposals don't have much effect on turnout because the turnout on the referenda, which come at the end of the ballot, is usually much lower, for example, than the turnout for senator or governor. The issues that will be advertised most heavily will probably be more appealing to Democrats than to Republicans. The redistricting, right? But I don't think it'll have much impact on the races above on the ballot. Yes?
So any gains that might happen in the midterm election for the Democrats, how solid are they? Are they likely to be overturned? I mean, given the trends over time, are they likely to be overturned in the 2020 election?
Well, part of it, of course, depends. We don't know who the candidates will be in 2020, right?
But I mean, just based on historical trends.
Well, one thing that's interesting is this is true in Michigan as well as across the country. If you add up all the votes cast for Congress, the Democrats have a majority, but they don't win a majority of the seats. The real important election will be 2020 because of the census and the redistricting. The census itself has become contentious because of the possible addition of this question on citizenship, which is, in my view, meant to degrade the quality of the data by forcing many immigrants not to participate and therefore to lower the population counts. This is going to be contested very heavily in the courts between now and then. And it won't end soon. It'll probably end just before 2020. But we'll have to see how that plays out. Yeah.
Thank you. You've talked about race and ethnicity. You've talked about sex and gender. Do you see any implications revolving around religion in this particular election cycle?
Well, I'm going to begin by saying I'm not an expert on religion and politics. But we know that evangelicals have become a force in the Republican Party. And part of our foreign policy seems to be affected by the role of evangelicals in the Republican Party. We'll have to see. First of all, this is an advantage for the Republicans. We'll have to see how things play out in the Middle East and whether or not the Trump administration, for example, can produce a peace plan or not that's acceptable to both Israelis and Palestinians. But despite all of these issues about sexual behavior in the Trump administration, the polling data suggests that evangelicals are staying with Donald Trump.
Do you think there ever be do I need the microphone?
So, yeah, this is for television, for the video. Yeah, for television.
Do you think there will be a time when the popular vote and the Electoral College will no longer affect the popular vote?
So the question is about the popular vote in the Electoral College and will things get changed? And I think not. Because there are two ways to accomplish this. One of them is with the Constitutional Convention. Nobody wants a Constitutional Convention. They're too concerned about what you could think of as ancillary issues that might come up once the convention was brought together. And I don't know whether, and of course the small states are opposed to losing the relative advantage that they have. I don't know whether this piece of legislation, which is a kind of a act of faith and goodwill on the part of states with big electoral votes to say they'll cast them for the winner of the popular vote can come to fruition. The easy states have already agreed to this. Other states that could contribute, for example, there was a discussion in the past week in Michigan, have said they don't want to participate in such a piece of legislation. So I think we've met a threshold, which is, I think, around half of the electoral votes needed to do this. But I think the other half is going to be very hard to get. The other half of 270. It's going to be very difficult to get. Other questions? Yeah.
During the Obama years, the Republicans won a lot of the local and state offices, and I recall some analysis suggesting that Democrats will suffer from a lack of experienced office holders and candidates for higher up. Is there any evidence of that impairing Democrats nationally this election or perhaps in the future?
Well, there is such a thing as a political career, and for people who, aspire to high office, they often start in the state legislature or, sometimes lower. But I don't think that's a real detriment to Democratic success. One thing that's very interesting in this cycle is the number of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan who are running for office, both male and female. So they're using military training experience as a proxy for legislative experience. So I think people who are ambitious and who want to enter public service will find ways to describe their career and its advantages for being elected. Yes.
And maybe lastly, the Russians. Do we have any concerns about the integrity of our electronic voting system related to the Russian influence?
Yeah. Well, the problem with the Russian influence in 2016 is that we're not really doing anything in an organized fashion for 2018 or 2020 yet. That that election administration is a strange kind of activity in the United States because, we don't really have national elections. We have state and local elections held on the same day. And it's very hard under ordinary circumstances for the federal government to get involved. They did after 2000. They put up a lot of money to buy new machines. But it's going to require organized activity on the part of the federal government to do something about this. What we hear from the people in the intelligence business is that they are aware of the threats and they can think of things to do, but there doesn't seem to be any initiative in the White House to make proposals or suggestions for budgetary allocations to deal with this. And the states are only relatively skilled in their ability to deal with these kinds of challenges and threats. It really requires an organized and centralized effort, I think. And we haven't seen that yet. All right, we'll make this the last question. I don't know, do you have to?
Millennials.
I don't have anywhere to go, but maybe you have to.
With millennials, I didn't see a whole lot on there about that. What are the trends? Voting, not voting, Democrat, Republican, etc.
Well, voting is an acquired habit. And the older you are, the more likely you are to vote until maybe you get to a time when there could be problems of infirmity or getting to the polls and so on. So millennials are entering a period of potentially high turnout. There's a kind of imprinting that could take place with regard to party ID as they begin to participate, who's running, what the issues are, and so on. I don't think we have seen a clear pattern that advantages one party or the other, but the next couple of elections will be very important in this regard.
Everyone, please. Yes, we thank Michael Traugott for this wonderful presentation. And I think I mentioned before that we are celebrating 25 years of the Wolverine Caucus with this forum. Mike Traugott, Professor Traugott, has been with us 11 times over these 25 years. So you can imagine how many election cycles and half-terms he has seen, commented on, and I personally have noted how accurate he has been over these years. So on behalf of the Alumni Association and the Office of the Vice President for Government Relations, we have an amazing blue gift here for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Veronica.
Professor Traugott. And also, we could not have done these 25 years without two very special people. Craig Ruff, who headed Public Sector Consultants, had to leave early actually, but Tom Scott is still here. And it was Craig, Tom, and I that helped to develop this caucus years ago. So if Tom Scott would come forward, I have a special pin for him. Wow. A gold Wolverine Caucus pin. So we look forward to seeing all of you in January when we begin the 2019 Wolverine Caucus Series. In the meantime, have wonderful rest of the autumn, enjoy the holidays, and definitely the election. And we will see you again soon. And thank you again for your support. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the legislators who joined us today, Representative Pam Ferris, Representative Adam Zemke, who introduced our speaker, Representative Stephanie Chang, and Rep. Youssef Rabi. So thank you again, everyone, and go blue.